As exciting as the World Cup is, sometimes the real excitement comes in the qualification. You wind up with legendary moments such as England being dominated by Norway back in 1993. Or that time in 1993 that England gave up a goal to San Marino right at kickoff.
Remember that Holland on this very ground. Oh, it's a mistake by Pearce and humiliation here.
In fact, some of the most dramatic moments in all of international play came during the qualification rounds, not the tournament itself. And that's the reason why I keep talking about this stuff. And by the way, if you're interested in watching old matches like these, you should go check out the link in the description to my Patreon. I've got a huge collection of these old matches, and you should go check it out. As you might remember, Canada qualified for its first World Cup back in 1986.
Swings it in, Bridge gets ahead on it. There's the shot, they score! George Pecos!
This came at a time when people thought that the sport was dead for good in North America.
Swings it in, near post, headed away, and it's in! It's in! Canada has got in front, 2-1!
Instead, Canada's World Cup qualification in 1986 was a major moment of national pride.
Tried to find somebody with it, but couldn't, all the way back to the keeper.
And although Canada didn't score a single goal in the tournament, just being there was enough. So that was back in the rough old days. That's back when the World Cup slots were really limited. It's not like today where like half the countries are making it, you know what I'm saying? There were only 24 teams in the World Cup back in those days, and only 2 made it from the North and Central America zone, Canada and Mexico, the hosts. Just getting that far was hard enough. And so there was some optimism going into the 1990 World Cup qualification process, which began in October 1988. First, however, Canada had to figure out who it was going to play, either Cuba or Guatemala. So in 1990, the qualification process for CONCACAF was a little bit strange. So there were 2 rounds of home and away matches that you had to get through before you could get to group play. Now, Canada was ranked high enough by FIFA so that they could skip the first round, and then they had to play the winner of Cuba and Guatemala in order to get to the actual group play. In other words, there was this huge amount of pressure on the team to win like right away. Guatemala beat Cuba in the first match by a narrow margin, only 1-0. Now, Cuba managed to piece together a first-half goal to make it interesting in the second match. Though the footage is grainy and of extremely low quality, you can still see just how sweet that goal was. But everything changed halfway through the second half when Guatemala won this controversial penalty. And when it scored the penalty, Guatemala gave itself the right to face Canada to try to move to the group stage. Anyway, my apologies there for the sketchy and really hard to make out footage. It's not like Guatemala was leading the world in technology back in 1988 anyway. And anyway, the one thing that we tend to forget about World Cup qualification back in those days is just how frustrating some of the rules could be. Guatemala was not necessarily the best team in the continent, but this was still a really difficult draw for Canada. For example, the United States wound up playing Jamaica during that same tournament, which was arguably a much easier draw. This was at the same time that the United States didn't really have a major association football league, and it also coincided with the United States' bid to host the 1994 World Cup. And interestingly enough, ESPN reported that it was not interested in the US-Jamaica series at all. Well, that gives you an idea of just how different things were back in those days. So from my understanding, Canada's games back in '88 were broadcast on the CBC. Later they would be on TSN. And Canada actually had its own league back in those days. There was the ill-fated Canadian Soccer League, which lasted about 5 years. The United States, meanwhile, simply couldn't get any television stations interested whatsoever. And any interest that might have existed died away when the United States played to a scoreless draw in Kingston during the first leg. Anyway, the United States managed to avoid complete embarrassment by demolishing Jamaica at home 5-1. And ESPN apparently relented, showing a 1-hour tape delay broadcast of the second United States-Jamaica game at 12:30 a.m. a few nights later. So there's a saying out there I hear every once in a while about the past being a foreign country. Well, the thing is, 1988 wasn't really that long ago, but in football terms, it seems like an eternity ago. The qualification for the CONCACAF tournament was hard to get into. If you had one bad match, you were basically out. And the other strange thing is that these matches didn't even remotely take place at the same time. So the United States finished off Jamaica in August. Canada, meanwhile, didn't play against Guatemala until early October. And the somewhat mysterious delay put Canada at a disadvantage. Two of its top players were busy playing in Europe and couldn't make it. The first match took place in Guatemala on Sunday, October 9th. Though Canada was the clear favorite, Guatemala managed to win by a hair, 1-0, similar to what it had done in Cuba. And it was another chance that was created by a controversial penalty decision.
Home series between Guatemala and Canada. The host nation scores the only goal of the game when Byron Perez scores from the penalty spot, beating Paul Dolan.
And sorry once again for the video aspect on that one is wrong. I'm not sure who originally digitized this, but they did it wrong. Anyway, Canada absolutely needed a win in the home leg and really could have used the sort of dominant performance that the United States got against Jamaica. Canada's dream turned into a nightmare right away when Guatemala scored easily.
Guatemala another goal. Randy Samuel working against his man. And it's a goal. Guatemala.
And the defending here was pretty atrocious. Canada's overly aggressive defending almost turned into a nightmare just minutes later.
For Guatemala. Plays it wide to Rodas. Rodas with the shot. And Ian Bridge got a head on it. Oh, my.
And then a mistake by the keeper led to Guatemala's second goal.
Oh, yes. Guatemala has scored off a corner kick. 2-0.
Canada did figure out a way to come back in the second half thanks to this excellent assist by Carl Valentine.
Valentine down the left side. Valentine will take it to the line. He's being pulled from behind, but the referee says play on, gets the cross in. Mitchell is there.
And then it was Canada's turn to win a controversial penalty.
Fitzgerald with a good move. Fitzgerald beats his man. And now the referee points to
Canada was desperate to score another one as soon as possible.
goal, Canada. And the Canadians race into the net to try and wrestle the ball from Jerez.
And the third goal came, giving Canada the match.
Second half.
But the problem was that FIFA was still using the away goals rule, so the two Guatemala away goals were clearly more than the 0 that Canada managed to score in Guatemala. So in other words, this wasn't quite like England's failure to qualify for the 1994 World Cup, which is where the team had ample chances and just didn't play well at all. Canada lost a tough 1-0 match in a difficult place to play because of a controversial penalty and then went down early at home. Now the team came back, but it was still a goal short in the end. And that was it for Canada's World Cup qualification until 1992. It was 2 matches and done. I mean, can you imagine an entire World Cup qualification campaign ending on 2 measly matches like that? As you surely know by now, the United States was the host of the 1994 World Cup. That meant that one CONCACAF spot was already filled. There were still only 24 teams in the World Cup in those days, and CONCACAF was awarded 2.25 spaces. Of course, most of the media attention was on the qualifying in Europe, and as you probably already know, that was a crazy adventure. But there was at least some sort of mention of the possibility of a third CONCACAF team making it. So personally, I'm not entirely certain how the math behind this worked. I'm sure that there were like coefficients and all this stuff that they use these days. So the second place CONCACAF team had to play against the winner of the Oceania zone home and away. Then the winner of that playoff would face against the 4th place team from South America. I mean, I know that the slots were really limited, but the logic here really is, I don't know, it fails me. Now, this time around, Canada's 6 European-based players were given time off to play with the national team in its fall qualifying matches. Canada started off in the second round where it competed against Central American teams, and it needed to get one of the 2 top spots to move on. Canada started things off on the wrong foot, however, barely scraping out a 1-1 draw in Kingston, Jamaica. And it's interesting to note just how little coverage the early rounds of qualification got in the Canadian press. Okay, to be fair, this was right in the middle of the 1992 World Series, and most Canadians were eagerly watching the Toronto Blue Jays. If you went and did like a survey of Canadians on the streets in 1992, I guarantee you that less than 1 in 10 would have even known that Canada was playing for the World Cup. Association football always had a following in Canada. You can find references to it going back to like the 19th century in Canadian newspapers. but it's never been the dominant sport there that it is in, say, Europe. But then again, there was this sense of foreboding as well around Canada's World Cup qualification that year. The worst came when El Salvador scored a last-minute goal in British Columbia to secure a 3-2 victory in early November 1992. And this really was a hard way to lose it. Canada was tied for second with Jamaica and really needed a miracle to survive. In the end, a dominating performance by Alex Bunbury helped Canada to a 4-2 victory over Bermuda. And despite playing to another scoreless tie, Canada was able to advance to the final round. Its group performance looked ugly though, 2 wins, 3 defeats, and 1 draw to barely scrape into the next round. You know, the fascinating thing to me about World Cup qualification is that there's so much of this national pride and symbolism that's riding on the line, and this is all just for a handful of games. Now, at least this time around, Canada had more than just 2 games to play, but the next phase certainly wasn't going to be easy. On April 25, 1993, Canada found itself on top of its group with 5 points, but had to travel to Mexico City for an extremely difficult away match. And this was really ugly. It was Ramon Ramirez who torched Canada in front of the massive crowd that afternoon. And whatever hopes Canada might have had seemed to fade away that day. But of course, the nice thing about extended qualification rounds is that you always get a second chance. And Canada did indeed get its second chance. Canada traveled to El Salvador again on May 2nd and got its revenge with a bit of free kick trickery of its own. And after what felt like a dozen chances on the back of this corner, Canada was able to drive home the game-winning goal, leading to one final showdown with Mexico. Canada's final group match was at home against Mexico, and the winner would automatically qualify for the World Cup. So it's kind of funny to read the newspaper articles about this one. This match was scheduled to be played in summer 1993, but the Canadian players were complaining kind of tongue-in-cheek. One of them said that they wished that there was snow in the forecast. And so a crowd of 12,000 showed up at tiny Varsity Stadium in Toronto for one of the most important matches in Canada's history. They were rewarded when Canada scored a goal on the back of this absolutely bizarre free kick, and the Spanish-language commentators went wild. But Hugo Sanchez scored an equalizer for Mexico only a few minutes later. Now, a draw here simply would not do. Canada had to win. Remember, this is back when everything was still 2 points for a win. So Mexico had 8 points after 4 wins, Canada had 7 points after 3 wins and a draw. So for Canada, nothing less than victory was acceptable. And things started to get ugly before too long. The match wound up disintegrating into an ugly set of fouls. And Canada put so many men forward that the defense was left wide open. In the end, it was a really ugly match with a lot of crazy plays like this one. And Canada's poor defending in the end led to its undoing. Canada put up a good fight, but in the end, Mexico was simply too strong. But that's not the end, of course. There was still the craziness of this intercontinental playoff. So Canada would now face Australia, who was the winner from Oceania, as usual, for home and away matches. This is back in the days before Australia was part of the AFC. And a win would allow Canada to face that fourth-place team in South America. Clutching defeat out of the hands of victory hurt, absolutely. But there was still another chance, as crazy as it seems. Canada hosted Australia on July 31st in Edmonton, and there was a major newspaper campaign to try to lift the spirit of the fans. And with that classic Canadian sense of humor, TSN gave the World Cup qualification match a very Canadian spin. So back in the old days when we lived in Canada, one of the things I learned is that those of us who grew up in the United States tend to take this sort of thing way too seriously. Honestly, life is a lot more fun if you can sort of laugh at things like this. Anyways, you can see here the newspaper ads really didn't work. The stadium wasn't even half full. And disaster struck at the end of the first half when Australia managed to score. This was ruled an own goal in the end, and it was a really frustrating own goal. Now, the Australian national team has its own drama, and I really should do at least a few videos on them. Australia dominated Oceania in those days and had dominated Oceania for decades, but it always seemed to come up short in that intercontinental playoff. For example, it lost to Scotland in 1986, it lost to Israel in 1970, and the ultimate indignity was almost certainly losing to North Korea in 1966. But all of that will have to wait for a future video. Canada finally got on the scoreboard with a freak goal from a corner that looked like one it had scored back in 1985. And then, less than 10 minutes later, came this wild flurry of shots that resulted in the game-winning goal.
Trying to get it across, looking for Valentine, gets it back, Mitchell Sweeney, off the near post, yes!
As strange as it seemed, there was still a chance for Canada to move forward. The problem, though, is that there was always that away leg that was waiting in the wings. That's the one thing about these World Cup qualifiers. They are exhausting experiences. It just goes on and on and on. Frankly, the crowd in Sydney was just as disappointing as the one in Edmonton had been. There was a little bit of roughhousing before the half. And then came one of the most fantastic World Cup qualifying goals I've ever seen to put Australia up 1-0. There really must have been some trash talking going on there, considering how angry that Canadian team looks. And this is, by the way, also the first time I've ever seen a Canadian goalkeeper take the ball and hurl it like that at another player. I mean, what a game. However, Canada was able to equalize on this desperate goal by Lyndon Hooper right after the second half started. Now it was Australia's turn to play with desperation. And in the end, it was this sensational header that gave Australia the lead in the match and tied the teams on aggregate. Extra time brought nothing but more frustration and ugly play. And this image says it all. In the end, the match went to penalties. And Canada wound up on the short end of the stick. This was a real punch in the gut considering how far Canada had come. But in the end, Canada just couldn't make it to the 1994 World Cup. Anyway, so keep that in mind this time around in 2026 when you have Canada, Mexico, and the United States all sharing the hosting duties. We could have had all three countries at the party back in 1994, it's just that Canada fell a little bit short. Australia faced a determined Argentina during the final round of the playoff.
Here comes a dangerous looking cross, and the goal! The goal for Argentina!
However, Australia was able to equalize only a few minutes later and completed its home leg with a 1-1 draw. It was an absolute fluke goal that beat Australia in the second leg in mid-November 1993. And in hindsight, it really feels like an awful way for a good team to lose. And anyway, if it's any consolation to Canadians, Argentina went out in the round of 16 in 1994. So I guess that means Australia was just about good enough to make it to the round of 16, right? Because they almost beat Argentina. And Canada was good enough to take Australia to penalties. So, maybe Canada was almost as good as Argentina. I mean, I don't know. I know that no matter what happens, you can always find these moral victories if you look close enough. Unfortunately, though, Canada will continue to struggle with qualification for years and years to come. It's not really until 2022 that they finally made it back to the big dance, which is one that I'm sure most of you actually remember. Anyway, that's it for this time around. Hope you enjoyed this. I'll talk with you again next time.